We will start this week with a discussion of culture, also a concept that most of you were familiar with if you've taken an introduction to sociology or an anthropology course. It is important to discuss first as the definition of ethnicity is directly related to culture. One of the most important questions in sociology was asked by Auguste Comte, considered to be the father of sociology in the 1800s. His question, what holds a society together? Do people feel a sense of belonging to a group? And if they do, what gives them that sense of identity and sense of belonging? The answer to that question is what we know as culture. As we go through this discussion, I will use Africa as examples, as this will introduce our first region of world cultures. This is a list of the objectives of this lecture. As I pointed out in the first PowerPoint that I used, these should be used as a guideline for this lecture. Just take a few minutes to read these. Culture can be defined simply as a group's way of life. A group has certain rules. What kind of rules? Why one set of rules and not another? At first, survival was the most important set of rules. But as groups settled in one area and began to farm, both agricultural and using animals to help in this farming, rules became more complex, and explanations for these rules began to develop. The leaders of the group justified these rules and their position in the society. Just think of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt who saw themselves as gods, given the right to rule their people. These sets of rules gave order to a society, what we call social control, although you may not like that term, but that's really what we're doing. Social control in many ways gives individuals a sense of safety and stability. People saw themselves as part of a group, a sense of identification. Now, obviously not everyone always agrees with the rules. They might leave the society or be punished for their disagreement. Most important about this thing we call culture is that it is not biological. It is socially built. Remember the definition of sociology, quote, groups and societies that people build, end quote. It is learned, passed down from one generation to the next. It is also important to remember that culture is dynamic. It changes to meet changing needs and influences. We will discuss this in more detail later. Another important feature and function of culture is that it reflects the environment of a group of people, where they might live, whether they live along a fertile river like the Nile, or more inland along the less arid desert areas, or isolated on islands or high mountains. We know the earth has been changing, so culture will reflect the environment and these changes. Culture is shaped by many things. Social forces such as wars, inventions, movements of people, as well as geographic features. Think about the most important geographic features that have influenced American society. As simple as being separated from Europe by the Atlantic Ocean. Then think about the expanse of land that allowed the original immigrants to have their own farms, something not available in Europe by the 1600s. Of course, these settlers pushed others, our Native Americans, farther west, but that's another story for another class. Go to the next slide and we will look at an interesting feature of the world. Looking at the topography of the world, we can almost see the migration of early groups of people, those around the Mediterranean Ocean, along the base of the mountain ranges, which run horizontally across Europe, what is now the Middle East and Southeast Asia. In the New World, however, the mountains run vertically, which is the way the early civilizations spread in this part of the world. The coastal groups on the Pacific into Central and South America, the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas. Focusing on Africa, we see very distinct differences in geography and climate across this continent. We are most familiar with the history of those areas across North Africa, a thin slip of land made fertile by the Mediterranean Ocean climate and accessible by that ocean as well as land. But other great kingdoms and civilizations of Africa existed on the eastern side, along the Nile, on the southwestern side. We are now just uncovering the remnants of these great civilizations. We also know that trade existed across the Great Sahara Desert as the desert developed, pushing groups of people to each side, along the Nile and farther south into the interior of Africa, establishing groups of people, tribes at the smallest level, kingdoms at the larger level, with distinctive ways of life or cultures. This slide shows us the parts of culture as sociologists have defined them. There are two major parts of culture, the material culture and the non-material or symbolic culture. Symbolic culture includes beliefs, values, norms, symbols, and language. We will look at each of these. First component is material culture, and probably one of the easiest to understand. Material culture refers to the tangible objects in a society, plus the technology to use these tangible items. If you look on the picture on the left, what you see is one type of culture, the types of houses that people may live in. This is probably a group in Africa. Could be other places, but let's just say Africa. You see that some of the people are wearing clothes, some are wearing less clothes. So again, a difference in the culture. Probably they are farmers, but again, I'm just looking at the picture. But if you go over to the right, you see another type of culture that we're very used to in Southern California, and that's the cars that make the traffic jam on the freeway. The cars are the tangible items, the roads are the tangible items. The technology is what developed the cars, but we also have the skills to use that technology. In other words, to drive a car. Some better than others, but again, different things. We also see in the picture in the middle, we see a computer and a woman sitting in front of the computer. The computer is the technology. Obviously, she has skills that have to be known to use that particular technology. We go down below on the right, we see a different kind of culture again. Here we see traffic jams created by bicycles. If you've ever been in any Asian countries, you sometimes run into this type of technology and culture, even though you can see right over in the corner there is a car, it looks like a truck. But again, people are used to riding their bicycles, so again, a different type of culture. The picture in the middle is looks like fashion show, and I kind of included this because I think it's very interesting to think about the different occupations that occur as part of the material culture of a society. Talk about non-material or symbolic culture, which takes a little bit more time because obviously there were many things involved in that, not as easy to explain in just one slide. So let's start with beliefs. And this is an important foundation of the symbolic or intangible part of culture. Examples would be religion, science, or just what we call, quote, common sense. These are all attempts to explain how the world works, or why we exist, or what happens to us before or after this life. We will discuss religion in more detail as part of culture and ethnic identification in week 5, as we examine the groups in the Middle East and later groups in Europe, even today, who are defined by their religious beliefs. Our next slide looks at the values and norms. These values and norms come from our general belief systems. First, values are attitudes, the way we think life should be, what is right or wrong. If you think about Christian values or almost any of the values of any of the religions, you'll find that there is a belief about what is right or wrong. For example, that it is good to love your neighbor. In all religions, we see the value of charity. So these are things that we think in our head. But from these values, these attitudes, come rules for behavior, and these are called norms. If it is a right attitude to love your neighbor or to believe in charity, or then how you are supposed to act. Say hello, help your neighbor if she is sick, maybe take food to a sick neighbor or to the elderly. Most societies value life or think that children and old people should be protected. Rules are established. Some are unofficial. Some are made official by the society. The official ones are sometimes called laws, and if these laws are violated, the society punishes the person who violates them. This moves from the individual level and goes up to the societal level. These official ones, in the process, we again see how we are social beings, going from the individual to the society level. Norms can be everyday guidelines, like walking on the right side of the hallway, or opening a door for older persons or someone with their hands or arms full. These are called the folkways of the society when they are the everyday guidelines. But when they become laws, that is an indication that it is serious and necessary for the society to function every day. Traffic laws are a good example. The value is an orderly society that everyone can go about their business. So you need to stop at red lights, drive according to the speed limit, etc. These norms, which enforce strongly held values, like the value of life, are called mores, from the word morality. A violation of these values would be murder, which usually receives the strongest punishment from the society. These punishments are sometimes called sanctions, from a timeout if you talk back to mom, to life imprisonment for breaking the law against murder. The most serious norms in the society are called taboos. For example, child molestation is an extreme violation of the value of a child's innocence and is considered so bad that a child molester is not accepted by even other prisoners in the prisons. Give some examples of values and how they develop rules of behavior for a group of people. For example, the value of honesty. The norm would be, don't tell a lie. The value, respect. Say things like, yes, please, thank you. Success is the value. Again, remember, value is in your head, it's an attitude, whereas the norms are the behaviors. So if the value is success, then one would work hard to obtain a lot of money and material goods. If the value is family, then the norms or the behavior would be to put your family first before your individual needs or interest. The opposite value, and sometimes we have both, but they kind of contradict each other, would be individualism, and the behavior would be the me first that we sometimes see in our society today. The next element of culture that we'll talk about are symbols. What meaning a group gives an object, a gesture, body language, anything that is not language itself, verbal or written language. This would be symbols as expressed by the body or gestures or an object like flag. Okay? This shared meaning allows individuals to communicate on this level. But the meaning of a gesture in one group of people may be different to another group of people. Look at the picture of President Bush. He is holding hands with a member of the royal family of Saudi Arabia. In the Middle East culture, this means they are friends. Men and women do not hold hands in public in Saudi Arabia. Men, however, do hold hands. This public gesture was very important to the relationship between these two nations. However, in American society, two men holding hands in public would have a very different meaning. Just to be nonpartisan. There's also a picture here of President Obama, who is bowing to the Emperor of Japan. This body language by the President of the United States to another ruler was criticized by many Americans who did not think he should have bowed. Maybe this relates to the fact that President Obama spent his early childhood, I think until about age 10, in Indonesia with his mother and stepfather. Maybe he learned part of a different culture there. So to him, it was almost automatic to make a gesture of respect to the emperor. The other picture shows some symbols. These are flags of different countries, particularly those of Africa, which we are starting to look at. And you can see how, look at the western part of Africa, and you see a crescent moon and a star, and that gives some indication that these countries have a Muslim religion, because that is associated with the Muslim religion, that particular symbol. The other symbol we see, and here I'm moving up again, is the little boy who's giving the thumbs up sign. Again, a symbol in American society that has meaning for us that might have a different meaning in a different society. Symbols are the foundation of communication, but language, which is the combination of symbols and sounds, is even more important. This quote from one of my favorite books, the third of Khaled Hosseini's books, called And the Mountains Echoed, is the best statement about the importance of language that I have read. You might know Mr. Hosseini's first book, The Kite Runner. His 3 books about Afghanistan are important reading. You will learn so much about the conflicts and people of Afghanistan, as well as great stories of people's resilience in these conflicts. Take just a moment to read this quote. That quote in the previous slide gives us the importance of language. It unites a group of people, allowing them to convey the way their group thinks and sees the world. We hear this so often from the first-generation immigrants who so much want their children and grandchildren to learn the language from their country of origin. And you might have heard the grandchildren say, I don't need your language. I live in this country and need to speak the language of my group of people. Americans are particularly bad about this. You have to speak American. We are the least bilingual of all nations, but hopefully that is changing. If we want to understand other cultures and interact with people of other nations, we have to understand their language. Why? Because language gives us perceptions of reality. The other thing I want to point out in this slide is the term paralinguistic signals. These are sounds, not necessarily words. Sometimes people might sigh or a clicking sound. As you watch the movie that I've assigned, which is God Grew Tired of Us, you will see one example of these paralinguistic signals. You will see one of the young men in that movie who clicks every time he is upset. So see if you pick that up watching the movie. Slide, the language gives us our perceptions. This is one of the most important things. The words that we learn enable us to, quote, see the world. A familiar example is that Eskimos have more than 100 words for snow. They need these words to distinguish the reality of their world. One word might mean the first snow of the year. Another might mean a type of sleet, frozen rain, or another word for frozen snow. We share many words with the British since both groups speak English, or do they? If you are in London and someone says they want a, quote, fag, do you know they mean a cigarette? Or if you are told to look for a zebra crossing, do you seriously look for zebras or for a pedestrian street crossing? This is what we mean by perceptions of reality. This is referred to as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, named after 2 gentlemen, one an anthropologist and the other a linguist, in 1929. Another term you might hear referred to Sapir-Whorf is the linguistic relativity hypothesis. So either one of these you might be familiar with. To give you an example of this, look at the next slide, slide 16. What is that? The drawing that I told you in the last slide to look at. Suppose I tell you that it is a giraffe walking by a second floor window. I understand this is my representation of this, but it is an image, a symbol. Now that I told you what it is, you can, quote, see it. That is an example of the Shapiro-Whorf hypothesis or the linguistic relativity hypothesis. Children are taught from an early age to categorize things. In other words, that's a dog, that's a cat, a truck, car, etc. While the process becomes more complicated, it gives us our basis for understanding the world, to know what we are seeing. To understand a person's world, we need to understand their language. This slide shows us the major divisions of languages in Africa. There are 4 major divisions shown in their major geographic regions. However, there are more than 2,000 variations of these 4 major categories. Africa is a continent with a great diversity of languages. Usually, at the tribal level, the group would have a language unique to them, while they also might speak English or French or other European languages from their colonial period. This tells us many things, that the tribal level remains important as a social group, and that the influence of outside groups have been important in the history of Africa. To summarize, why is all this important? Why is culture important? It is a large part of who we are. For example, true, we are born male or female, quote, but our culture tells us what that means. Does it go beyond just the physical characteristics, or are there expectations because of those physical characteristics? Is there a way that a female should think? Is there a way that a male should act? All of these come to us from the society around us and are part of the values and norms of our culture. Culture is our identity, our sense of belonging. True, some of us identify stronger or less than others, as we will talk about with ethnic group identification. Also, language, which is part of culture, gives us our perceptions, our names for what we see, and enables us to think, and gives us the ability to communicate with each other. All in all, culture is so central to who we are, how we think of ourselves, and our sense of belonging. 2 other ideas or concepts that I want us to know, because they will help us eventually to see the importance of identification with ethnic groups. These 2 words are ethnocentrism and culture shock. Ethnocentrism means that we judge other cultures by the standards of our culture, feeling our culture to be the correct one. We look at other people and we might say, why do they do that? Or why do they dress that way? Without taking their cultural background into consideration, the values and norms that they might have that form their group identification. When visiting other cultures, we might experience culture shock. Many of us do. This culture shock is a sense of disorientation or confusion. We might experience this as what we call homesickness, and it might increase the ethnocentrism. We might feel very uncomfortable. We might say, where can I find food that I like? Why don't these people have certain kinds of food or do certain kinds of things? Because we feel so disoriented. These 2 terms are going to be very important to us later in understanding group relationships, of how people interact or how groups of people or individuals interact with each other. Obviously, members of any society don't look, talk, or behave as they did 100 years ago, or even 10 years ago, as things change so quickly. So our empirical evidence shows us that cultures change. Many changes in societies are linked to changes in technology. Those technologies which have a major impact on society are sometimes called new technologies. Changes in technology have a significant impact on the culture of a society as well as its structures. The use of computers, for example, would be a new technology as it has changed the way we live, communicate, work, and even the words we use. Technology is also related to inventions and discoveries. Not all parts of culture, however, change at the same time. For example, technology usually changes first, that is the computers, but values and norms are slower to change. Should gambling on the internet be illegal? Which sanctions should apply if you're gambling online in Las Vegas, but are still here in Los Angeles? Usually our values and behaviors are hurrying to catch up with technological changes. This tendency for one part of culture to change at different rates than other parts of culture is called cultural lag. In other words, the material culture might change, that is the technology, but maybe we're hurrying to catch up with values, norms, how to behave. Now let's go back. Go to the top of the slide again. Okay. Technology is one way that cultures change, but change also occurs when societies come into contact with one another. Cultural diffusion occurs when people of one society adopt some aspects of another society's culture, which I show in that picture, the chicken Maharaja. In other words, McDonald's has gone into India, but since they don't eat beef, there has been a slight change to chicken, but it came from the contact, this cultural diffusion with another culture. An example can also be seen in the American range of eating habits. As different groups came into our society, they brought with them their food: Chinese, Thai curry, hot dogs, and many others. Travel and communication have changed to such an extent that many people in many parts of the world, particularly the urban areas which have more contact, dress and act in similar ways. You might land in a different country and think, well, gee, these people look the same. This process is referred to as cultural leveling. Particularly, we might see it within a country. Here in the United States, sometimes if I'm in a shopping center in San Diego and a shopping center in Massachusetts, if I close my eyes, I think, wow, it all is the same. Until I hear sometimes the language. Language can be very defining. Shows us a list of things that significantly changed the culture of Africa. Environment played a part as the Sahara lost its ability to sustain horticultural or pastoral groups, pushing these people into the Nile River deltas, along the coast, westward to the Atlantic, and southward to the savannas and rainforests. Also, the importance of the Iron Age for all civilizations cannot be overstated. For African societies, there is a great diversity of the levels, but increasing sophistication in weapons and tools brought the development of more complex societies, from tribal groups to kingdoms. Iron ore and other natural resources were mined, including gold and diamonds, which first attracted Portugal and Spain to the western coast of Africa, and later Great Britain, Belgium, Germany, most of the European countries, to the Congo and to South Africa. This richness of resources continues to pull even today. More than 2 million Chinese are in Africa today, investing in the infrastructure of African countries, hoping to cash in on these resources so necessary for computers, cell phones, etc. Invasions by other groups, nations, brought new elements of culture to Africa, one of the most important being religions. African nations from the Middle East brought Islam to northern and western Africa, and European countries brought Christianity to the middle and southern parts of Africa. Obviously, all of these influences have had a great influence or change on the culture of Africa. Many of them have adapted to the European and Asian influences, creating a unique and combined culture for these countries. We will talk more about these later as we begin to talk about several of the tribes of Africa today. This has been a review that you learned in Social 101 or in an anthropology course, or many other subjects talk about culture because it's so important. This lecture has discussed culture, a concept in many disciplines that explains a great deal about what holds a group together. It gives individuals their sense of identity, a sense of belonging, a set of rules for behavior, explanations for questions that we cannot explain any other way, questions about life and death. This is a social phenomenon, and I always point this out, that culture is built by people and is dynamic in their changing lives. We have given some examples of Africa, and as we continue, please keep these concepts in mind because we will talk again about their importance as we discuss not only Africa, but the other cultures as we move around the world.